It's also a confirmation of what the church has proclaimed for millennia, that we are not made to be alone, but we are made for covenant.
Sociologist Dr. Brad Wilcox speaking at this year's Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
So give today's young men and women the truth that they deserve. Pursue marriage, pursue it with intention, and pursue it in your 20s, when the window is widest and the possibilities most open. The road ahead, of course, is not easy, but it leads somewhere worth going, and you, 20-somethings here, were made for this journey.
You can watch and listen to Dr. Brad Wilcox making the case for 20-something marriage from the 2026 Making the Case conference. For a $250 gift by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to video and audio recordings of the entire conference. Learn more at issuesetc.org. Clergy running for and holding public office is often portrayed in the media as something new, but it really isn't. It's a storied account in American history. I think all said, about 110 clergy and counting have held public office at the national level. The very first Speaker of the U.S. House was a Lutheran minister, Frederick Muhlenberg. Welcome back to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Joining us to talk about media coverage of clergy running for public office, Terry Mattingly. He's Senior Fellow on Communications and Culture at St. Constantine College in Houston, Texas. He writes Rational Sheep, a Substack newsletter on faith, family, and mass media. He's author of the national On Religion column for the Andrews McMeel Universal Syndicate, and for 2 decades, he led the GetReligion.org website. Terry, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
So what's up with the Democratic Party lately offering candidates who are mainline Protestant ministers or at least seminary students?
Well, yeah, I think the main thing, they get to call themselves a pastor, and that's a whole different way of relating to the American public. But really, I feel to some degree, based on the emails I'm getting and the social media I'm seeing, I really think we're in some sort of gigantic flashback to the first campaign in which Barack Obama ran for president. And obviously, Barack Obama was not clergy, but he was very upfront about his church ties. He sang hymns in the middle of sermons. He made references to gospel choruses, allusions in his imagery, and he ended up getting more people to vote for him for president, even out of the hardcore evangelical marketplace of ideas, so to speak, than anybody had in the Democratic Party for quite some time, as opposed to choir robe-wearing Southern Baptist choir singing Bill Clinton, who kind of lost that part of his own image somewhere. But what we're really seeing here is really important, and it operates on several levels. And as always, I want to focus on it from the viewpoint of journalism, because the emails I'm getting from people, and of course Tallarico in Texas is the person I'm hearing about the most, but now we have the United Methodist pastor of currently the largest church in the United Methodist Church. Now that's after the split in which a lot of large conservative churches and others left. But now we have a pastor who's legitimately the pastor of the largest church in the United Methodist Conference, or in their denomination, is now the candidate for the Democrats in the state of Kansas. So what I'm getting is email that says that basically is the same thing I heard with Obama. Well, Tallarico is a seminary student and he's on his way to being clergy or something, but he's not a real Christian. And if you go online and do a search of social media and you search for Tallarico, then in quote marks, real Christian, unquote, you're going to find all kinds of stuff. And as you would expect, the New York Times did a lengthy piece on this. But in its own way, the New York Times validated the main point I want our listeners to think about today. The mainline Protestants who are running for office as Democrats all agree with the doctrinal stands taken by their own denomination's hierarchies. So if you're going to say they're not a real Christian, I can understand why some people want to say that on certain issues. But you're asking journalists to say that someone who is in good standing with their own denomination, and even a denomination with the previous evangelistic heritage of the Methodists, these people are not real Christians on the basis of doctrinal issues for the most part, in which their own denomination, or at least the leaders of their denomination, perhaps not the people in the pews, the leaders of their denomination back these stands on moral, cultural, and social issues. So you're not going to convince journalists that these people are not real Christians. There's never going to be an item in the Associated Press Manual of Style where you're going to flip back to the R's and look up the term real Christian. It's never going to be there. It's never going to be in the Associated Press Manual of Style. And if it did, and if they were really honest, real Christian, the definition in the style book would be someone who believes the doctrines that I do and the doctrines that fit with their party's platform. Well, that would be a pretty good, honest answer to this question. But here's what we can talk about now, because it's been pulled right out in the open in some of the coverage that we'll be discussing today, including most of all that New York Times piece and a major piece by Religion News Service. Doctrine is now back on the table. For a long time, if you tried to say that religion had anything to do with doctrine, you were in effect saying that the Associated Press style book should have a doctrine clause, a doctrine definition. What is doctrine? Well, for years, doctrine was just another way of saying really ancient, old stuff that clashes with what realistic modern people believe about life. In other words, doctrine is automatically old and automatically wrong. But in recent years, or decades even, doctrine has become, if you had an AP style book right now, that it would say, you'd look up doctrine, and it would say, see political ideology. Most journalists are convinced when Catholics talk about doctrine, it's just political ideology. It's just another way of saying it. When evangelicals say they believe this or that about abortion, they quote famous statements by other Christians, that what comes through the ears of the political beat reporters covering them is political ideology. And that all of the evangelicals who said they had some doctrinal reasons to vote for someone like Donald Trump, how many times did you see that translated in news stories into simple statements that this is their political ideology? It doesn't matter what their church says about it. It's all politics, and we know it. Well, here's what's fascinating about the new wave of coverage. Listen to this headline from the New York Times and tell me what word jumps out at you, okay? You ready? In Senate race, Tallarico challenges heretical right-wing Christianity.
Well, heretical.
Right, because if something is heretical, what does that imply?
Well, it implies that it's outside the pale of Christian orthodoxy.
Correct, which means there is such a thing. In other words, to have heresy, you have to admit, A, that doctrine exists, and B, that there is some standard for what doctrine is right and what doctrine is wrong. Oh my goodness. This means in some settings, if journalists are going to treat this issue fairly on both sides, they need to ask real, live doctrinal questions to political candidates when the other side raises them. So when Tallarico accuses you of being an heretical Christian because your views on immigration disagree with him, and you're also disagreeing with the Pope, also, by the way, which matters in a heavily Latino state like Texas, will the press follow up when someone says that Tallarico is a heretic on the issue of gender and gender identity, according to everyone from the Southern Baptist Convention to the Roman Catholic Catechism? Is someone going to ask doctrinal questions to the liberal mainline left with the same fierceness that they will aim questions from time to time at, justifiably sometimes, at conservative and right-wing politicians, not the least of which would be Donald Trump, the man who defines this era? But my point here is I think that doctrine has been put back on the table. What's the moment in Lord of the Rings? Meat's back on the menus, boys. Well, doctrine's back on the menu in this election year. If these stories are all right, or all right, however you want to say that you get to talk to candidates about whether or not their beliefs match up doctrinally. Now, the mainliners, like I said, can all say, oh, I agree with the doctrines of my own church. At which point, it's fair to say, well, what are those? And they're going to say, well, we shouldn't be discussing what my church believes because that's just religion. Well, has the religious right been asked any hard questions about what they believe on religion for years and years? In the end, this really ends up being an interesting question. Are mainline Protestants Christians? What I argued during the Obama years is that people on the right side of the political spectrum needed to accept that Barack Obama was a liberal Christian. And they'd say, no, he's not a Christian at all. He doesn't believe the right things about it. And I go, he's not your kind of Christian. He's honestly a liberal Christian. Now, can we get the press to admit that? And that's where we still are today in this new story.
Terry Mattingly is our guest. We're talking about media coverage of clergy running for public office. We'll get to that big RNS story next.
Essential exercise for the Christian mind. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
What's the difference between guilt and shame? And where can we find freedom from our shame? The Issues, Etc. book of the month for August is From Shame to Glory, Surprising Remedy for Injustice and Failure. It's written by regular guest Dr. John Kleinig. From Shame to Glory is published by Concordia Publishing House. Their phone number 1-800-325-3040, or browse before you buy at issuesetc.org. From Shame to Glory, Surprising Remedy for Injustice and Failure, the Issues, Etc. book of the month.
Hearing is taken for granted until you don't have it. It happens at all ages. Unfortunately, some are born deaf. Others lose it gradually. The end is the same, a world of silence. The Ephatha Lutheran Mission Society serves the deaf and hard of hearing domestically and internationally. They're the only recognized service organization in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod devoted solely to the deaf of all ages. Learn more at elms-deaf.org.
Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Terry Mattingly is our guest. We're talking about media coverage of clergy running for public office. Terry, you mentioned a few moments ago that long religion news service piece. I noticed, first off, that the word attack appeared 10 times in that piece, as long as it was. You'd think an editor would advise the author to come up with a different word. But it came to me that this story is really less about the candidates and more about the quote-unquote attacks on them.
Well, that's the conservatives' pounce. Isn't that the phrase we would use? But here's other things that are going on directly related to your question. Back to why are they running these candidates? Well, first of all, look where they're running them. They're running them in states where they have a political reason to do so. And Kansas has a long history of populism in terms of economic issues, not so much cultural issues, but economic issues, agriculture issues, etc. So running a mainline Protestant in the heavily mainline Protestant Midwest is not a bad card to play. And I've already said in Texas, we'll see what happens when Tellerico hits the fury of political ads and stuff. And yes, from my opinion, at me if you want, readers and listeners, but it would have helped if they had run a more centrist Republican candidate in Texas, because the one they ran does have some questions, religion and otherwise, about his own life. But the point is, it made sense to run someone who can stand at a microphone in the state of Texas and say, oh, I agree with the Roman Catholic Church on health care. I agree with the Roman Catholic Church, even though I'm a mainline Protestant. Let me tell you what Pope Leo said the other day about immigration. Let me tell you what Pope Leo said the other day about treating people with dignity instead of yelling at them and being cruel to them. You see what I'm saying? It gives them a response to the God gap, which has been one of the biggest realities and often least covered realities in American politics in recent years, which is the more you go to church, the more you sit in a pew, the more likely you are to vote for culturally conservative candidates. So for Tallarico and for the Religion News Service, which is a news organization that I'd be interested in knowing what percentage of their coverage focuses on mainline Protestant churches. It's got to be over 50%. It sometimes functions as a press agency, often legitimately, of the mainline world. So when you attack mainline clergy, you're attacking the editors of the Religion News Service. And you're attacking their readers. You're attacking their donors, probably. So my point is, this is about mainline Protestantism, and frankly, whether mainline Protestantism, if discussed openly, with hard questions going both ways, will fly in the heartland of the United States, let alone the Bible Belt. But in an age right now when Democrats are facing headline after headline about nominating Democratic socialists and people who are not just critical of Israel, but are angry and hate Israel, I think that's safe to say, or the current regime of Israel, for sure, I think Democrats right now are saying, okay, forget the left coast on both sides of the country. Forget the East Coast and the West Coast. We're going to have to get some people who can talk about God if they're going to run in the center of the country. Now, if we can just avoid some of the 80-20 issues related to culture and religion, the one that shows up in all the polls is gender and trans rights. And if they're going to do that, we're probably going to have them avoid a lot of those 80-20 issues on issues of morality, culture, and stuff that tend to set people off and show up in attack ads, which is what you pointed out justifiably about this RNS piece. If we can keep these candidates away from what their churches teach about all of these cultural, moral, and social issues, we at least have a candidate who can talk about God without their fingers being crossed.
What did you make of the New York Times piece?
Oh, it has the best summary of this. If you were going to say, what is this whole story about? You can point at 4 paragraphs in the New York Times story and instantly know what this is about. So, I mean, this is him saying, I'm out here to turn the tables over, his favorite reference to Jesus upsetting the tables of corruption in the temple. Help me turn over the tables, and we're going to break those stranglehold that conservatives have on American politics. So I'm going to read all 4 paragraphs because it's the perfect summary. I don't see myself as challenging the Republican Party, he said. I see the real fight as all of us, whether we're progressive or conservatives, Democrat or Republican, uniting together to take on the very powerful people who have corrupted our politics and who are corrupting our church. Unquote. His victory has unleashed a wave of fury from conservative Christian leaders attacking the theological underpinnings of his political positions and moral values. Hours before his victory last Tuesday, prominent politicians, activists, and pastors began assailing, that's a different word than attacking, assailing what they called Mr. Tallarico's blaspheming tongue. They blanketed podcasts, social media platforms, and right-wing media outlets with video clips of him using the story of Jesus Christ's conception to defend abortion rights, saying God is non-binary, and finding spiritual truths beyond Christianity to support religious pluralism. Such positions, they argue, were an abuse of Scripture that disqualified him as a Christian leader. As he moves into the general election, Mr. Tallarico is pushing Christians to reclaim what he sees as core principles of their faith in American political life, including compassion for immigrants, helping the poor, and loving one's neighbor. It's all there. Everything you need to know is right there. That's essentially, is it wrong to ask questions about the doctrines that he holds on unpopular issues, as well as the doctrines he holds on popular or more popular issues from the viewpoint of his own church and many others, including the Catholics?
So do you think a mainstream journalist would even think of asking these Democratic candidates who happen to be religious leaders this question? The book of Genesis states twice, male and female, he created them.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile this with your position that there are more than 2 sexes? That's a position that at least two of these candidates I know have publicly taken.
Yeah, that's a really easy one, and the non-binary quote will be in all kinds of ads when we hit the weeks leading up to the election there in Texas. And what does he mean there? He's going to learn to quote all kinds of interesting people to defend himself, but the question isn't going to go away. Once again, the situation of trans females competing in DNA female sports is really going to be another hot issue going in. You can already see it in ESPN and all over the place. Did you notice the really interesting thing in that list of things that people are assailing him about? Finding spiritual truths beyond Christianity to support religious pluralism. What is the doctrinal issue right there? Okay, if you remember from years of discussions, when I was covering the religion beat, and I was trying to get my editors to realize I needed to ask doctrinal questions when covering bishops, for Pete's sakes. They were saying, oh, those are all political. The resurrection is not political. And I came up with those 3 questions in the TMAT trio. Number 1 is, did the resurrection actually happen? Now, it's going to take a unique situation to ask a Senate candidate that. But my second question was always, is salvation found through Christ alone? Now, that's something that has come up in Senate hearings, in the confirmation of candidates, with Democrats asking questions that got them accusing of establishing a religious test for Republicans who believe that salvation is found through Christ alone. I read that phrase in that New York Times piece, finding spiritual truths beyond Christianity to support religious pluralism. I see that as a question about universalism. Is Tallarico a universalist? Well, if he's a typical Presbyterian Church USA pastor, not the same as someone in a pew, yes, he probably is a universalist. But if he keeps bringing up this point, we need to believe that there's truth in other religions, and would it be fair game to ask him, where do you draw the lines on that? Do you believe there are any significant differences between how Judaism, Islam, and Christianity view the Godhead? Well, at which point editors are going to pass out. You're assailing him about his religious beliefs. Well, but what if he keeps talking about the issue? At some point, will someone ask that question? You're right about the Genesis thing with gender. I see that a fair question if they keep talking about gender. But by the way, I don't think these people running in the heartland and even in the Bible Belt, I don't think they're going to volunteer to answer any questions about gender in sports, locker rooms, bathrooms, dressing rooms, etc. I don't expect them to go there. But if they do, your question is valid. And if someone like Tallarico or Adam Hamilton, the candidate in Kansas, keeps talking about why he supports the doctrines of his church on gender, why he supports the doctrines of his church on marriage, why he supports the doctrines of his church on police, whatever, if someone's going to bring it up, at some point, if doctrine's back on the table, we've got to say it's okay to ask questions.
One of the things that I found also a bit annoying about all the coverage was its lack of context. I mentioned at the outset that ministers running for and holding office at the national level in the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate is not a new phenomenon, and it's not a rare phenomenon. I think it's 110 and counting that have clergy who have held elected office in either of those august bodies. And as I mentioned, the first Speaker of the House was a Lutheran minister who had been a delegate to the Continental Congress before that. This is kind of an American thing, isn't it?
Well, it's an American thing because it's America. For example, we shouldn't be surprised that African Americans who come out of the church, including occasionally some clergy, become leaders on political and moral issues because that's been their role in their community for decades, for more than a century. So we shouldn't be surprised that any African American who wants to run for office in the United States probably needs to be able to answer a few God questions. And Obama went to school and learned how to do that. He learned how to do that talk. And, of course, I was in Washington during the Obama years, and one of the stories I kept thinking somebody needs to cover, where does Barack Obama go to church? And one of the problems he had was that the church in Washington, in his own denomination, the United Church of Christ, the single most doctrinally liberal mainline Protestant church, the church in town that he most logically would go to was almost completely, totally white and full of well-off, well-to-do, liberal white folks. So he didn't go to that church. I don't know if he ever went to that church while he was president. He went over and over to black churches where he was welcomed, but behind the scenes, and I can only think of like one story someone wrote about it, people asked the question, why hasn't Barack Obama joined a church? And black pastors were asking, why hasn't Barack Obama joined a church? That's another way of saying, if you're going to identify with a community, it's probably okay to ask questions about, as Mattingly would put it, how do you spend your time, how do you spend your money, and how would you make your decisions? Whereas if you're going to say you're a believer in the following tradition, it helps to be able to prove it. Well, what better way to prove it than to run an actual clergy person for office? And especially if you've got journalists convinced that if any hard questions are asked to them, that's an attack, that's railing, that's assailing, whatever the words can we use, grilling, etc., etc. We're going to see this now for the next couple of months. Like I said, I think it's very important. And I can also stress one other thing here. another valid story, and Ryan Berg has got the numbers and the receipts. This is also going to raise the question of the differences between mainline Protestant clergy and the beliefs, including political beliefs, of the people in their own pews. And I'm hoping we eventually see a long sit-down interview with Ryan Berg run in the New York Times or something about this issue. Where did the division come between the people in mainline pulpits and the people in pews? And if that isn't a logical question to go with this current trend, I don't know what is.
Terry Mattingly is Senior Fellow on Communications and Culture at St. Constantine College in Houston, Texas. He writes Rational Sheep, a Substack newsletter on faith, family, and mass media. He's author of the National On Religion column for the Andrews McMeel Universal Syndicate, and for 2 decades he led the GetReligion.org website. Terry, thanks.
Glad to be here.
Casey Belts will join us on the other side of the break. We'll discuss understanding burnout.
We're going to have to be vigilant on 2 different fronts. We're going to have to defend the truth about the human person, made in the image and likeness of God, created male and female, created for marriage. We're also going to have to defend our freedom to live according to those truths.
Dr. Ryan Anderson, president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and member of the White House Religious Liberty Commission, speaking at this year's Issues, Etc. Making the Case conference.
Over and over again, we're going to see that we have to form the next generation of our students, of our children, our grandchildren to believe the truth, while also defending our freedom to live it out. And then the long game is reforming our civil laws to reflect the truth.
You can watch Ryan Anderson's presentation, Making the Case for Social Conservatism, from the 2026 Issues, Etc. Making the Case conference. For a donation of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch an on-demand video stream and download audio recordings. Order online at issuesetc.org.
We're supported by listeners like you. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Hymnody is important, very important. It's an invaluable tool that helps teach and confess the faith. Singing hymns is something we all do together on a weekly basis, yet some congregations find it difficult to sing confidently without the support of an instrument. If you are one of these congregations that can't find an organist, Church Music Solutions can help. Our substitute organist service allows your hymns and liturgy to be played on your instrument to help inspire and support your congregation's song. Keep singing with Church Music Solutions.
For nearly 140 years, the Lutheran Witness has taught the faith, defended it against error, and shown forth the great treasures of the Lutheran Church and biblical doctrine. We're continuing this legacy by publishing issues and articles that help you see the world from a Lutheran perspective and that teach biblical doctrine and show forth the treasures of God's Word. Visit our website to learn more and how to subscribe, witness.lcms.org. The Lutheran Witness, helping you interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.